Hello everyone and welcome to a new video. This is the next installment in my wardrobe upgrade. I knew a few blouses would be essential, so today I'm working on this pattern from Folkwear, the Gibson girl blouse, for that iconic lacy Edwardian look. Let's just talk really quick about the Gibson girl. This was an early Edwardian phenomenon, a new aesthetic look, based on the illustrations of Charles Gibson, portraying the new feminine ideal. Gibson's New Woman was a gentler version of the emerging suffragette, requiring some degree of independence but no unconventional femininity. Meet Camille Clifford, one of Gibson's models and an iconic Gibson girl. She was a famous actress and popular for her sensational beauty. Okay, but the blouse? So, this pattern is called a Gibson blouse and looks like a standard lacy blouse shirtwaist, very popular at the time. I am absolutely obsessed with the Edwardian skirt and blouse combo. This pattern looks very promising. I decided to go with View A, which has all of the lace insertion. View B is a simpler style which can be adapted to printed fabrics. I made a mock-up of this and was happy with the fit. It's only really fitted at the top yoke, the rest is quite loose. The first step in View A is to create the fabric from which the yokes will be cut. This involves two large rectangles of the main fabric, pin tucks and lace insertion. I started by cutting out the rectangles and pinning on my lace. The guide for this is not to scale, so I placed my first strip of lace 3 inches from the edge. I then marked the pin tucks. The pin tucks are 1/4 of an inch wide. I marked the line that they would be sewn on, marking 3 lines, each 1/2 inch apart. This should leave some space in between each pin tuck. I then basted all the lace on and started by tackling the pin tucks. Now this isn't the most accurate method by any means, but it worked for me. I simply folded the fabric along the marked line, finger pressing and pinning. I then sewed it by machine 1/8 of an inch away from the fold, using the marker on my presser foot as a guide. Ideally, you would iron in between each tuck, which makes them lay nicer and less prone to shifting, but as I used heat-sensitive pen, I didn't iron the piece until all of them were done. This was a lengthy process. Once all the tucks were done, I moved on to the lace insertion. There's a lot of it on this blouse, so I'll only really explain it once and try to keep the rest short. This is the same method I used for my Edwardian combinations, which I thought worked well. First, I sew down the lace that has been basted along both long edges. I did this in a short stitch and in a discrete piece of the lace. I then went in from the wrong side and cut the fabric in between those two stitched lines. I then ironed these little flaps of fabric outwards. These iron folds are then zigzag stitched over and trimmed back. It's a pretty neat finish. I then had to cut into all this hard work, and it was kind of heartbreaking, so I kept all the little leftover scraps because reasons. I placed the yoke on the rectangle, making sure the middle of the yoke aligned with the middle of the rectangle, and particularly in the middle of a section of pin tucks, so that they would then look well against the pin tucks on the blouse. I've said pin tucks now like 1,000 times. I marked the shape in notches and then cut it out. I then used the same method to mark and do the pin tucks at the center front of the blouse. The next instruction was to sew up the side seams. I think a good finish for this lightweight blouse would have been French seams, but I wasn't confident that I wouldn't need alterations, so instead I sewed normal seams, which are flat felled further on. I didn't need any alterations in the end. Placing my pattern back on the blouse pieces, I used a tracing wheel to mark the lace insertion placement. Again, there are better methods, but personally I hate using carbon paper, and this worked for me. The wheel left little marks on the fabric that were easy to see but disappeared once the fabric was ironed. I tested the scrap before doing this. Once I had the guide marks, I pinned my lace into place and repeated the process as described. There is a lot of lace insertion. I better pick a good soundtrack for this. The lace on the blouse is interesting. It overlaps in some places. For this, I decided which strand of lace was on top and made sure this was mixed in both sides of the blouse. I then sewed on one strand first and then the other, sewing lace over lace. The next step was to sew 2 rows of gathering stitches across the top of the blouse front, between the notches. I set my machine to the longest stitch. Securing one of the threads around a pin, I then pulled on the bobbin thread from one end, distributing the gathers until it was sufficiently gathered. It helped to pin to the yoke while gathering at a strategic point, such as the middle and the ends. I used the pin to struck the gathers to make them look nicer. This was basted and sewn by machine. I then trimmed back the yoke seam allowance as this was bulkier and folded over the blouse seam allowance, pinning into place and felling by hand. I moved on to working on the back yokes. 2 rows of gathering stitches are sewn between the notches on the back. I used the same method of pinning the yoke on and then gathering as needed to fit. This was pinned and basted and sewn by machine. I also felled this by hand. The ties are ironed inwards and folded in half so there are no raw edges. They then recommend you can top stitch this in place, but I, of course, deciding free time is not a necessity, sew the edges by hand with a small whip stitch. These are then positioned at the back of the blouse, where there are another 2 rows of gathering stitches, which I showed myself sewing but cannot remember where. The ties are pinned into place and then gathering stitches are pulled to fit, matching a notch on the tie. I tied off the gathering stitches and then pinned the tie over. This can also be machine sewn, but instead, you guessed it, I'm doing it by hand. For the collar, I cut out strips of lace to match the required length. Then I sew these together by hand whip stitching them together. The final strip of lace has 1 row of gathering stitches, done by machine. The bobbin thread was pulled together and the lace becomes this one curled strand from hell that won't lay flat. After taming it into position, I pinned it on top of the edge of the collar and sewed it in place by hand. This blouse construction would have been a lot quicker if I just used my bloody machine. Then I turned under the raw top edge of the blouse, hemming it into place. At this point I realised I hadn't actually finished the back edges, I just skipped over that bit of the instructions, so I turned the raw edges under. This is a large seam allowance to allow for the closure. This was whip stitched down. I then finished hemming and could attach the collar. The collar was pinned into place and sewn together. The last step was to work on the sleeves. I decided to not do the lace insertion as on the pattern. I'd like to say this was a stylistic decision, but honestly I was sick and tired of lace insertion by this point, and I just wanted it done. So, instead, I just cut out the sleeves and sewed up the side seams. The seams were felled by hand, leaving a small gap at the bottom so I can get it on and off. I then sewed 2 rows of gathering stitches at the sleeve head between notches. I pinned the sleeve on, matching the notches, and then pulled the bobbin thread to gather as needed, keeping most of the gathers to the top in front of the sleeve. This was then basted and sewn by machine. To finish this seam, I encased it in lace tape by wrapping the tape around the trimmed seam allowance and sewing it by machine. I finished the gap at the cuff by turning the raw edges under and whip stitching it. I sewed 2 rows of gathering stitches 1/4 inch apart at the cuff. For the cuff, the pattern describes a historical cuff, which as far as I can tell is just a bias-bound cuff without the gap. Instead, I used the pattern to cut out 2 strips of lace. These were sewn together by hand across the top edge. I then turned the short edges under and sewed those down too. I gathered the cuffs to fit the lace and then quickly put the gathers through my machine to secure them. This edge is then fit in between the 2 strips of lace and sewn by hand. I've lost this footage, sorry. Last step is to hem the bottom of the blouse and to sew on 5,000 hooks and eyes at the centre back. And that was done. I love this blouse. It's lovely and comfortable and delicate and everything I wanted from this pattern. I'm a bit torn on the collar, not sure I like the ruffle bit, but it's staying on for now. And I would say there are 2 options for the length at the back. I chose the longer one and the blouse was still a little short for me, so just keep that in mind. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon for more history-bounding wardrobe adventures.